Welcome to the session. I'm finishing off this weird alien eyeball thing today. I want to talk about my process with these kinds of drawings. This is what I consider low-stress drawing. I have a tendency to dive in and just start making things, and I often have very little in terms of goals at the beginning, though sometimes I have some semblance of an idea. There are a couple things that I do, and I think they might be beneficial to you if you just don't know what to draw one day, or you want to start trying to approach things like this. If you've been enjoying these sessions, or this sounds like something that you would like to see more of in the future, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps out a ton. The first thing I do whenever I start a piece like this where I just don't know quite where it's going to go is I start with very light tones. Now, if I'm working digitally, this isn't so much of a concern because you can work over it, kind of ad infinitum. But if you're working with brush pens like I am here, pencil, ballpoint, watercolor, whatever it is, if you start with really, really light tones, then it kind of doesn't matter what decisions you make at the beginning. You can always go back over things. You can always shift things. You can always change things. So you'll notice at the top of the drawing where I am right now, you've got these really light green tones. That's what I started with. I just picked the lightest green that I had, and then I would start kind of sculpting out forms and ideas of what I wanted to put down. As I formulated a little bit more of that idea, then I could go in with some darker tones. But for the most part, I kind of held off on starting anything darker than about a 50% gray before I really was committed to what I was going to do. There's a temptation early on to start throwing in darks, to start getting in blacks and really, really rich, deep greens and reds and blues and things like that. It's a temptation I think all of us face. And honestly, when I start oil painting, I often start with the darkest tones. But when I work on things like this, where it's exceedingly difficult or impossible to take white over a darker tone, I try to just build it up in stages. I spent a lot of time working with watercolor in my youth, and I think that's probably why I have these skills built up. Watercolor and gouache are another medium that does this exceedingly well. So if you're in a position where you're like, I don't know quite what to draw, or I don't know what to do, these are fun media to just kind of explore with. The brush pen set I have, which I love by the way, and you can check it out in the description if you want to see the brand and stuff that I'm using. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but they've just taken very good care of me. It's the Kingart brand, and there's a bunch of really, really light colors. Really light grays are some of my favorites to work on because I can just lay things out and kind of see where the shapes are and what they're doing. And that helps with the starting process of building the piece. And I think mostly I start with the light tones because they don't dictate what I do next. If I get the light tones down, whatever they are, they're going to be fine because it's just not that big a deal if I shift and go a totally different direction. And of course, if you go back and check some of my old sketchbook sessions that are done with brush pens, you'll find that in some cases there are just kind of weird, really light lines outside of the shapes that I landed on. It doesn't matter. If this was going to be some kind of final project where I was doing something more substantial for it, I would plan more, but not all of our drawings have to be done in a fully planned manner. And I think that there's been a tendency in the last 5 to 7 years to have sketchbooks that are just these beautiful artifacts. Like you finish them and every page in it is just fantastic, it's wonderful, it's beautiful. But I don't think that's a bad thing in and of itself, but I think it is a bad thing for artists in general to think of sketchbooks as being these articles, these artifacts. A sketchbook should be able to be ugly. You should have ugly pages in it. When I finally finish this sketchbook that we're looking at right now, and I go through it and do a sketchbook tour, there are going to be some drawings in there that are just dumb. There's going to be ugly drawings, there's going to be dumb drawings, there's going to be bad drawings. There's going to be sketches that I never returned to. There's going to be half-completed drawings. It's a sketchbook. Like, I'm not getting paid to finish the sketchbook and hand it to someone. And if I was, and you see these on Instagram a lot where people finish a sketchbook and then they sell it, that's just a different product. And that's fine. If that's what you're doing, that's totally fine. But we, as just the general populace of artists, should not be beholden to that. We don't have to do that. We can just use our sketchbooks to brain dump whatever's been on our mind that day or whatever we feel compelled to put down. So I think that drawings like this are fantastic. They allow you to be creative. They allow you to forge new ways of managing your creativity. And if you really embrace it, they are super low stress. Because I don't really care where this goes. Like, worst case scenario, it's a bad drawing. I don't use the recording for this session, which I did because I kind of enjoy where it went. But that's the worst case scenario. Like, that's a couple hours lost. And frankly, I learned things in that time, so it's not time lost entirely. But yeah, my first strategy when you're doing drawings like this is I would always recommend starting really, really, really light. And this is something often you'll learn in drawing classes when you're younger too, is always draw really, really lightly with your pencil at first. Like, you can always darken things, but it is difficult to lighten things often. Another really good thing that I would recommend, a really beneficial aspect to employ in this kind of drawing, is don't marry yourself to whatever idea you start with. And this might sound strange, so stick with me for a minute. So I started this piece, and I kind of knew that I wanted to work with an eye. One of the last pieces I worked on was a large cephalopod drawing that's on my Instagram that was a blast. I didn't record the process, and probably good because it took a long time. It took like maybe 12 hours. But it's just this giant eye of like an octopus type creature underneath the waves with barnacles and all these things on it. So I was fascinated and kind of enamored with that. So I knew I would start with an eye. And I knew I wanted to do some tentacle things. And I kind of thought originally it was going to be more cephalopod. It was going to be an octopus or a squid or something. And so different portions of this piece have been different things along that journey. And if you look closely at the tentacle that's right above the eye, it actually looks like it's got gums or it's got nails on it, like it was going to be a claw at some point. And the ones down below, the two that are almost in line with the black portions of the pupil, those look like teeth if you look really closely, because they've got the gums kind of wrapping around them. But the idea changed as I started working on it, and because I wasn't married to what I was doing, it didn't matter. You know, if you were really going to examine this, you'd be like, well, that doesn't quite make sense, but again, this is a drawing for fun. And because I didn't over-specify those things, I didn't commit with really, really dark tones, I was able to just kind of shift it, and now it's become this weird plant material. And I don't really know, it's kind of like roots, but they're green. And as the drawing develops, it kind of just takes on this otherworldly, almost Lovecraftian concept of it's a being, it's alive, is it plant, is it animal, I don't really know. And that's fine. I wasn't married to the idea of it being an octopus. I wasn't married to the idea of it being a plant. I was married to the idea of completing a page of drawing, of doing something that was fun, of working on my shading, of learning more about space. When I get to the bottom of this drawing and I start really working on getting the kind of sub-aquatic mountains, I was paying a lot of attention to making sure that the tones in the background are more washed out and they're lighter. These are the things that I've been working on. And so I'm incorporating little aspects that I've been working on artistically in other capacities. You don't have to do that. That's not a big deal. But I find for me, because I'm always trying to work on specific things and get better at specific things, and I'm terrible at landscapes, so I've been working on a lot of landscape stuff in my free time, of course that's going to kind of find its way in and incorporate itself a little bit into the drawing I'm working on. But everything here, like the cool, weird plant Lovecraftian thing, it occurred because I didn't marry myself to any idea specifically, and I kind of just kept moving, I kept going. Another thing that I want to consider and kind of think about when it comes to this kind of drawing, and I want to have y'all process it as well, is I didn't use any references for this piece at all. But the pen piece that I mentioned a few minutes ago, I used tons of references throughout it. I used references for barnacles, for tentacles, for seaweed, for crabs, for hermit crabs, for sea anemones. And so some of that's in my brain when I moved into this, and I've got some of that idea. But this piece was done specifically without the stress of looking up references. Everything's been pulled from my imagination or memory. And is the result as good? Well, I think I can say no, but it also had a different goal. The goal of this piece is to exercise the skills that I learned when I look up references. And frankly, like looking up references and drawing things is fun, but it's a different kind of fun than building something out of your mind. I think the best is the harmony that you get when you combine the two elements and you move forward with that. But on this piece specifically, I did not use any references. This is all just pulled from my brain. And I know intellectually that the piece would be better, it would be more accurate, whatever that means, if I had used references. But I didn't need to. This was a piece for me and to share with anyone who's watching this at this moment. So with all of you, I wanted you to be able to see this is the process that happens when I don't use references. I've got plenty of other pieces on here that you can look at if you want to see how I work when I use references. I'm pretty proficient at that. What I'm not very proficient with is creating things entirely out of my mind or out of memory and imagination, and that's what I want to get better at. So that's what I'm doing for these kinds of things. So it's kind of odd. Like, I know reference often gets a bad reputation, but like it's ridiculous. Reference is necessary in order to get better. The amount of stumbling that you would have to do. I mean, just imagine if you're drawing like a deer and you don't look up a reference and you're committed to not look up a reference. Your goal is just, I need to get better at drawing deer. Well, cool. So you're going to draw a deer. It's going to be terrible. You're going to draw another one, and you're going to, every single time you're going to try to focus on like one thing. Like the face looked terrible. Okay, well, let's draw a different kind of face. Well, that was terrible too. And yeah, I guess after like 50, 60, 70 times of doing that, you might find one that's like, this one's closer, and you marry yourself to that idea and then start tweaking off of that. But that's inefficient. You know, if you want to learn how to draw a deer, like look up some references of a deer, copy a bunch from different angles, and then start drawing deer from, you know, your imagination and memory, and then go back and correct the portions that didn't work. Like, oh, like I can't seem to get the direction the antlers are going. Well, then go back now and look at references based on that. So there's space for both. Both are relevant, both are good, but yeah, it's just this piece, I didn't use it. I don't always use it. I've got at least 2 or 3 other pieces I'm working on right now that are all reference based. And I think I did 5 or 6 little paintings last week that were all reference based. So I bounce back and forth, mostly because if I do that, I'm able to focus more time over the course of a week on things. But that might be because of some ADHD stuff. You know, it's just, you know, personal strategies for making sure I actually do the things I want to do. So here's a fun thing that I like to do with pieces like this as well, is I love throwing in things that don't necessarily make sense. So I think anytime you have something that's a little mysterious or odd, it just makes it a little bit more tantalizing. It's more interesting. You want to look at it more. You know, in this case, it might be as simple as it's an eye wedged in a whole bunch of vegetative matter. Well, obviously plants don't have eyes, so what's going on here? Originally, maybe it was going to be a mouth or it was going to have some claws coming over it, but it's not that now. So now it's just an eye suspended maybe underwater in some kind of plant-based material. There's naturally some mystery to that because these things don't occur in our world. I think the other thing that this then naturally dovetails into is storytelling. That anytime you have a piece like this, where you've got elements that beg questions, elements that force curiosity, naturally you're going to start thinking about like, well, what's going on here? Like, where is this? Why is this thing existing in this capacity? And even for something as funny and silly and small scale as this drawing, there are storytelling elements. It exists in an environment. Its size and scale are very difficult to discern, but it exists in an environment. It seems to be underwater. There seems to be bubbles. There seems to be other things happening. So there's some curiosity. And at the end of the drawing, I even start putting in what might be like the shadows of other forms like this somewhere, you know, in the rest of the ocean. So the storytelling elements, even if they're simple like they are in this piece, just incorporating little things where it's like, this is going to make the viewer, the audience member, look at it and ask themselves some questions. It's a wonderful thing to include. And I think it's actually a really great way to like start pieces in general, is just start thinking about, how do I inject some storytelling elements in this? How do I make some things that are really intriguing? This is one of the things that I really have enjoyed about Elden Ring. The more that I come back to that game, is the design of like every building, of every region, of every boss, every enemy seems to be storytelling in nature. There's just so much environmental storytelling, and it makes it intriguing. You know, you notice weird things about like, well, this guy's clothes are really similar to this guy's clothes over here, or the structures on this castle seem to have been added after, you know, the initial building of the thing. All of those pieces give you some different understandings about what's happening in the world, and it makes it more intriguing and it pulls you back in. And I don't know how many playthroughs I've had on the game so far, but every time it's interesting. Every time it's fun, because it's different every single time. Tears of the Kingdom, the new Zelda game, has done a lot of this for me as well, because there's so much environmental storytelling everywhere you go. Hyrule has been through so many changes, from Breath of the Wild, where you had the 100 years after the calamity, then you had, Link returns, Zelda returns, they beat Ganon, and then you go into Tears of the Kingdom, and it's been, 5 to 7 years maybe, so there's things happening there. There's all kinds of stuff happening in the world, and it's visible, in the storytelling, but primarily visible in the visual storytelling. And I think one of my favorite places for this has been all the Sky Islands, because they're really interesting architecture, and some of the buildings have fallen apart in different capacities, and it's just fun to explore. And that maybe is like why open world games have taken off. Well done ones have taken off in the last couple years, because if they're done well, there's just so much to explore, and it's just fun to explore. Like, so much of the time that I put into Breath of the Wild originally on my playthroughs is just like, oh, there's a mountain there, I'm gonna go to the top of it. Why? I don't know, but because it's there and I want to see what's there. And you can inject a lot of those kinds of elements into your artwork, not forgetting for a moment that the games that I just described are artwork, but you can inject a lot of those similar kind of components into your artwork by just increasing the level of mystery, increasing the level of, symbols and logos and things that are mentioned in there, tiebacks to other work, tiebacks to pop culture, tiebacks to the culture in the world that this exists. Anytime you can include mystery, anytime you can include those kinds of things, you're just going to give the viewer and the audience a little bit more ability to inject themselves and their understanding into it. And in so doing, they're more invested. And you often will become more invested in your own work as well if you do this. So yeah, just all around, I think it's a good idea just to throw some things in there that don't necessarily make sense, but they create this mystery and the need for storytelling to explain those mysteries. And when it comes to telling stories in general, I think that that's probably just the most important thing that there is to do with art. We are especially coming to a place now with how AI is moving and how proficient digital artwork is, and digital photography and stock photography and all these things, that the necessity to draw or paint like a human face has just gone down over the last 100 years. There was a certain point before cameras were really widely available that if you wanted to record what somebody looked like that was your only option. And then that faded out when photography became way more viable and cheaper and quicker. And I think that there was still an enclave of that held out and still holds out and will always hold out. But I think it's been reduced again. I think AI and the digital realms, like just how much photography there is out there, it's not as necessary to just illustrate what a person looks like, And that's why now if you go on Instagram and you look at all of the portraiture that's being drawn and painted, whether it's digital or it's traditional, whatever, it's got a lot more character in it. Like, there's storytelling naturally baked in, and sometimes it's just baked into the colors. A couple of my favorite people to follow on Instagram, they alter the colors dramatically. But the colors tell story. The colors tell us something about the artist and something about the person that they're illustrating. And storytelling has always been incredibly important. I mean, if we go way back in art history, the original pieces, I say the original pieces, but really like we're talking amphoras and mosaics and things in ancient Greece and Mycenae and Minoa. We're talking about things that were representative literally of historical events or chronicled historical events. And so that was storytelling. It was real storytelling, but that's not really any different. And that's why art came into being. And now, we're sitting here some goodness, 10,000, 12,000 years hence, and it hasn't changed. That component of art hasn't changed. In fact, it's probably more beneficial than ever. There was a day and age for a long time where the ability to replicate something perfectly, to illustrate something perfectly, was seen as magical. And it's still very cool, but there's a reason that a lot of people look at the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists and just think of that as the height of painting. There's a lot of people that consider people like Monet and Van Gogh to be like the top painters of all time. And I think part of the reason for that, historically and just from like an art analytical side of things, is because when Van Gogh painted something, it didn't literally look like what he was painting, but it captured a feeling, it captured an emotion, and it told a story. And I've heard chefs talk about this before too, where like if you make a dessert that's based on apple pie and it doesn't taste more apple pie than apple pie does, then the dessert's totally like worthless. Like why make a peach dessert that tastes less peachy than just eating a peach? And it's kind of the same thing with painting and drawing. Like the goal is to illustrate something that is more than what that thing is. Part of the reason why we love Lord of the Rings, like all of the characters in Lord of the Rings are like hyper extended forms of the trope that they are embodying. You know, we can't be Aragorn, we can't be as good as Sam, but they're tropes and they're taken to this extreme. They are, you know, Sam is more human than human. Like he's all of the wonderful things. And Aragorn is like more man than man can be, a better king than kings can be. Gandalf is wiser than wise can be. And that's what we get to do with our art. That's what we get to do with the stories that we tell in it. Like we're here to illustrate things and to talk about things and to tell stories. And so incorporate the stories into your work and tell new stories. And yes, you know, if you go back to Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. And that's fine. Maybe there is nothing new under the sun. It just doesn't matter then, because if everything that can be done has been done, then just keep doing, because it's all pointless anyway. So just keep executing. My take on that phrase is that, yeah, that probably is true, but it's the personality of the individual and how it comes forward that really makes it, you know, unique and personal. And you can have 50 people who all paint the same subject. And so, you know, i.e. the same thing, you know, has been done before, right? But each of those paintings are going to touch a different audience differently. And that's why your art is important. Your personal art is important. So please hear me now. Whatever you're making, whatever your desire is to make, whatever story it is you want to tell, whatever world you want to build, do it. Commit to it. Yes, it's going to be hard. Yes, it's going to take more time. And you're probably not going to have a lot of people in your life who are real encouraging about it. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Like, if you've got that urge and that desire and that need to make things, then it's not going to go away. So you might as well just start. You don't need to, like, give into it entirely and, like, forfeit your life to it. But you ought to give into it in some capacity and start making and crafting and creating. And find people to share it with. And so if you're still here, I would love to hear in the comments down below what you want to make, what you want to create. If you're really honest with yourself, what story do you want to tell? Do you want to make a graphic novel? Do you want to make movies? Yes, I know it's like terribly impractical for normies like us, but so whatever it is that you want to make, whatever it is that you feel drawn to create, I would love for you to share it in the comments down below. I'll continue to unpack all of the stuff that I want to make, and it does come up in some of the podcasts sometimes as I talk about things. So I'm not hesitant to share that as well, but I would love to hear from you guys in the comments down below. Thank you for hanging out. If you're still here, I would love for you to subscribe and like the video. It does help a ton, like I mentioned at the beginning. And yeah, just keep drawing, y'all. Keep drawing. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.